Good morning and welcome to the Darasat expert seminar on does cancel culture need to be cancelled. I'd like to make sure that everybody can hear my voice clearly. If you can, just please indicate that with a raised hand. Let me just see the participants. Okay, everyone can hear, excellent. So today's discussion will be on cancel culture, which has been making a lot of headlines in the last 2 or 3 months with the Black Lives Matter movement, previously with Me Too. Most recently in the case of J.K. Rowling, who's been threatened with being cancelled on the internet, the author of Harry Potter, and then she and a group of other public intellectuals signed a big letter, open letter, which they published, asking for or questioning the virtue of cancel culture. So today we'll be discussing this issue. The format will be that I will talk for about half an hour and then we'll have open Q&A. So what is cancel culture? This is a picture, I believe, of 18th or maybe 19th century USA, something called tarring and feathering. The man on the sticks being held up has been doused in tar and then covered with feathers as a form of public humiliation. And that's what cancel culture is. It's generally publicly humiliating people, primarily now via the internet. And then it also includes secondary consequences, things like people being fired from their jobs, people having their ability to speak in an event removed, being uninvited or disinvited, or having their social media accounts closed in some cases, as happened to Katie Hopkins in the UK. And Donald Trump, President of the US, has had a few of his tweets deleted or censored because they contain fake information, or what Twitter at least presumed to be quite fake information. Why do economists care about cancel culture? I'm an economist, and you may be wondering why we talk about something that appears to be a sociological or psychological phenomenon. This picture is a picture of Gary Becker, who's a very famous economist. He's passed away now. He won the Nobel Prize, I believe, in the early 90s. And he's a pioneer of using economics to study sociological phenomena. So the reason economists are interested about cancel culture is because economists in general are interested in how people behave, and in particular, how they respond to different sorts of incentives. And cancel culture is a very special kind of incentive, which we'll discuss in greater detail momentarily. It involves social sanctions. And that's why economists are interested in it, because it has a big impact on the way people behave. Eleanor Ostrom, who we'll talk about a little bit later, also won a Nobel Prize for related issues. So this is, although you can say that economists usually may be interested in things like stock markets, investments, and money, we actually have a much wider interest than is commonly perceived, and that includes anything that explains how people behave. So to understand cancel culture, we have to do some basic economics to give the background. We have to understand what a negative externality is. This is a picture of a beach that's been polluted. A negative externality is basically what happens when, well, to understand negative externality, let's first of all explain what happens in a conventional good. In a conventional good, when there's no externality, then when I consume that good, nobody else is affected. So, for example, if I watch, a film on my TV, nobody else is affected. If I eat an apple, nobody's affected. That's to be contrasted with goods that have negative externalities, where my act of consuming the good affects other people negatively. So if I pollute, if I eat a chocolate and throw the wrapper on the floor, that's causing pollution, which causes environmental damage. It makes the place look less attractive. and basically affects other people negatively. Or, for example, if I play very loud music, then the act of me consuming the music that way affects my neighbors and affects them adversely. And the thing about negative externalities is that if we let people consume goods that have negative externalities to the level that they want, then what we might find is that we'll have too many of those goods. If we don't punish, if we don't try to control how much companies pollute, they'll pollute a lot. If we don't fine people for not cleaning up after their dogs, then they'll make the streets very dirty, and so on and so forth. And that's why governments, for example, put in Europe taxes on petrol consumption. That's why we have strict environmental regulations. These are all efforts to stop negative externalities from damaging society. Now, there's two general classes of solution to negative externalities. The first is what I call external enforcement. This is a picture from Leviathan, the book by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and it reflects this idea of a third party being given material resources and being given authority to punish people who produce too many negative externalities, or putting rules down, and then when people violate those rules, they punish those people. So this is probably the most salient solution to the problem of negative externalities. An example would be if my son hits my daughter, as an external enforcer, I will punish my son, whether it's timeout, or grounding, or whatever. That's a external enforcement within the familial unit, but in the government level, at the governmental level, I gave you some examples earlier. For example, the government fining or a company that pollutes too much, or in contrast, if the United Nations spots a country committing war crimes, it may punish that country. That's at the international level. So external enforcement operates at every level and is a very common way of holding people accountable. So when is external enforcement good and when is it bad? It's good because if you give the third party enough power and if you give it a good amount of information, it can be very effective at stopping negative behavior. Children behave well in school because the teachers are effective external enforcers, the principals are external enforcers, and so on and so forth. And if we didn't have those teachers and we didn't have those principals, then there'd be complete chaos with all those children. The same is true in society. We have police officers, we have judiciaries, we have militaries, and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, they're able to do a good job of enforcing law and order because we give them the material resources and we give them the power that they need. However, there are some disadvantages associated with external enforcement. This picture describes one of them, which is corruption, which I'll come to in a moment. But before we get to corruption, one of the major problems with external enforcement is that it's quite unwieldy. It can be quite administratively cumbersome to externally enforce. In something simple like the family unit example I gave you earlier, with me punishing my son for hitting my daughter, or hitting his sister, okay, that's easy to do. There's not some elaborate process. I can assess the evidence and dispense the punishment very quickly, and it's quite an efficient process. But if we look at the international level, which is the other end of the extreme, it can take many years for justice to be dispensed. If you see trials of war criminals, it can take literally 15, 20 years to hold war criminals accountable for their actions. And then even at the governmental level, when somebody commits a crime, it can take several months before the investigation is complete and before the punishment is administered. And taking or changing or modifying that system is a very slow process because there's many checks and balances, there's many people involved, and it can be quite slow. So that's one problem with external enforcement. The second problem is the one in the picture, which is corruption. If you give a third party significant power, both materially and administratively, in order to hand out punishment, that power can be abused. Now, in all systems, we have efforts to use checks and balances to limit the likelihood of power abuse, but it can happen. Sometimes that power is abused for selfish reasons, such as when, if I'm the mayor of a county, if I'm mayor of a city, and I give my cousin or my son's company, award them tenders to produce things inefficiently, but for their financial benefit. That's an example of corruption for the direct benefit of the person who has the power. Alternatively, it could be because of what we call regularity capture. So sometimes the entity that is governing, that is performing the external enforcement duties, is captured or is manipulated by one of the parties that is controlled by the external enforcer, and the tail starts to wag the dog. And a good example of that is in utilities regulation across the world, where we see, for example, in the UK, there's been problems in the telecoms regulators, because the telecom regulator has many people who used to work in the telecoms industry, and they start going easy on the telecoms companies. So we always have to be wary when we create external enforcement that the power that we endow the external forces with is liable to be abused. And we have to realize that even though we put systems to prevent or limit that from happening, it's not a perfect solution. The alternative to external enforcement is what we call mutual enforcement. And this is a picture of Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner, I believe, in 2008, and the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. And her work was she used to study what's called common resource problems. So when you have villages and small societies that have a common resource, and they need to be careful how they consume that resource to avoid exploiting it and depleting it, and what kind of systems they produce to monitor and manage that resource. And a lot of that is what's called mutual enforcement. So by mutual enforcement, what we mean here is that people police each other. Rather than creating a third party and giving that third party material resources and authority to police people, people police each other either by punishing each other directly, and that can be what's called extrinsic punishment. For example, if I go to a restaurant and that restaurant serves bad food, or that restaurant, the management treat me badly, or the staff treat me badly, I boycott that restaurant and decide to not go to that restaurant again. That's a financial consequence for that, for the misbehavior by that restaurant. That's what's called an extrinsic incentive, or it could be something more psychological, what's called an intrinsic incentive. For example, if I play in a team and I'm not doing my job, then people in the team will not look me in the eyes, or will make me feel as though I'm an outsider. And that can be that psychological incentive can be very important in influencing my behavior. So what is cancel culture, finally? Well, cancel culture is a form of mutual enforcement. It's where we use a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic incentives via the internet to enforce good behavior. One example is doxing, which I put in front of you. So what's doxing? Doxing is where if I think that someone has behaved badly, I can put their personal details on the internet and ask people to put their address, and then ask people to harass that person by releasing their personal details. Called in the middle of the night. Maybe if I have sensitive information, I'll release that, and this person will be embarrassed. That's one example of cancel culture, and that can be a very extrinsic in consequence. So can having the person fired from their job because they have made comments that are deemed to be inappropriate. Or it can be intrinsic incentives, just the bad words being said about them, that person being ashamed and excluded when they go about their daily business. Now, when does cancel culture? Notably, I should just add that there is additional features defining characteristics of cancel culture. Unlike external enforcement, mutual enforcement, or specifically cancel culture, is very decentralized. So it's not as if there's a central authority which directs people on how they need to behave, whom they need to punish, how they need to punish them. No, it's very decentralized and very spontaneous. Nobody has institutional authority to guide people in cancel culture. People may put their opinion out there, people respond to the opinion, but ultimately it's a spontaneous exercise, a spontaneous behavior, and highly decentralized behavior. In contrast to something like a government punishing a company that pollutes or putting someone in prison for stealing somebody else's property. Cancel culture is the other end of the spectrum. Now, when does cancel culture work? This is a picture of Harvey Weinstein, who's the inadvertent poster child for the Me Too movement, and he was accused by a very large number of people of sexual assault and all sorts of other very serious violations of good conduct. And this was done not via the legal process initially. It was done via Twitter, via social media. And as a consequence, this opened the door to him being put under trial, and eventually he was found guilty, and I think he's just been put in prison for something like 18 years. So this is an example of cancel culture working, because previously this external enforcement failed because this person was, the people who had power to hold Harvey Weinstein accountable were not doing their job properly, and there was an environment of fear around reporting him for his misdeeds. And so people who were victims of his behavior were staying quiet, and he was able to continue doing very bad things. And so here, cancel culture successfully stopped him and many other people from doing that kind of thing. When is cancel culture less effective? So here, this picture signifies somebody saying one thing and somebody understanding something else. And this captures the essence of when cancel culture is ineffective. The problem with cancel culture is that it depends on how, for it to work properly, everybody has to understand each other well. When people don't understand each other well, then this can lead to misunderstandings, and this can lead to big punishments that are not in the right place. To give you an example, recently the word blacklist was, which is, commonly means a list of things that are unwanted or should be avoided, like a blacklist of people who should not come to this nightclub, or a blacklist of politicians who should not be voted for, or something like that. So the word blacklist contains the word black, and some people, not all people, can think that this is offensive, but other people use it and don't think it's offensive. And so these misunderstandings regarding whether it is offensive, whether it isn't offensive, can lead to a situation where if the cancel culture itself, the punishments meted out according to cancel culture are meted out unfairly. And I'll discuss this a little bit more in a moment. But it's very much, unlike the case with Harvey Weinstein, here, everybody would agree that what Harvey Weinstein was doing was unacceptable, and there's no misunderstanding. The only reason he wasn't being held accountable was a failure of the alternative to cancel culture. But when you have words like blacklist, when you have certain statutes that are put up, which I'll come to in a moment, that people want to remove, then it can be the case that not everybody agrees on what the punishment should be, and so you can have a dysfunctional administration of punishment, of justice via cancel culture. Now, along those lines, we should know that cancel culture is a response, often, not always, but is often a response to ineffective external enforcement. This is a picture of a statue in Brussels of Leopold II, the former king of Belgium. And he's just an example of many famous people who are commemorated in statues, and people who, by modern standards, and even by standards of their time, in many cases, committed very bad crimes. You can see it says, this man killed 15 million people, also says some things which I shouldn't read out loud. But anyway, Leopold II was king of Belgium when they colonized Congo, or modern day Congo, and committed unspeakable crimes. And there are many other examples in the US. There are many statues of former generals and key personnel from the Confederacy during the Civil War in the 19th century, and many of these figures cause offense to a significant percentage of the population. And of course, if there's a statue up that you don't like, there are legal channels for requesting that the statue be removed. You can do a petition, you can send a letter to your parliamentary representative, you can address the government and so on and so forth. But what's happened in many countries is that this channel was not working. And one of the reasons it wasn't working is because of what I discussed earlier, which is that there's an abuse of power. A lot of the time, the people in charge of these decisions are people who do not represent the views of society very well, who perhaps have some selfish or ulterior motive, and as a consequence, the existing channels were not doing their job. And as a result, people took matters into their own hands. So when one criticizes cancel culture, and there are some criticisms, it's important to realize that cancel culture, especially when it seems very abrupt and blunt, is sometimes a response to external enforcement failing to do its job properly. Now, let's talk about some advantages of cancel culture before we discuss the disadvantages. So the primary advantages of cancel culture equate to the disadvantages of external enforcement. It's very flexible and it's very adaptable. You remember that when we discussed external enforcement, we said one of the problems with it, it's very unwieldy. It can take a very long time for the judicial system to work, for people to be found to be doing the wrong thing and to be held accountable. Whereas the mutual enforcement, the cancel culture as a form of mutual enforcement can be instant, it can be very adaptable and very flexible as circumstances change. And a good example of that is Me Too. So Me Too allowed many women to feel instantly significantly safer in their places of work or in their daily lives, because men who are committing these crimes and who are misbehaving immediately felt that they would face consequences potentially for some of their actions, and therefore were less likely to behave in that way going forwards. And this happened literally overnight. In a matter of days, men who were previously behaving in a very oppressive way went from being oppressive to being much more careful about what they were doing. And that's hundreds of times faster than we would expect from the government or from some other central entity in terms of incentivizing good behavior. That doesn't mean that external enforcement doesn't have a role, but we can see that one of the advantages of cancel culture is that it's very, very quick and much quicker than the alternative. And it's very adaptable too. So when Me Too started, it was primarily about women feeling as though who'd been abused by men. But it turned out that certain men had been abused, and other people had been abused by different groups. And so this was all, Me Too was able to very quickly morph into being a broader umbrella and giving a lot of other people the ability to feel as though they were getting protected. Now, it's not all good for cancel culture. The problem with cancel culture is what's called herding, which has an analogy to financial markets. So here you can see a group of cows running, or bulls perhaps, herding and running off a cliff. And this is what happens in financial markets very often. So what's the reason for this in the case of cancel culture in financial markets? Well, to understand this, first of all, we have to note that in many situations, how we behave is a function of not just what we think directly, but also how we think other people think. So if I say, if I use the word blacklist 10 years ago, I think that I'm confident that blacklist is not an offensive word. Now, if I use the word blacklist, I'm not sure. Is it offensive? Is it not offensive? I have to be careful, and I have to take into account who the other people I'm talking to think and what they think in order to choose whether I think it's something suitable to use or not. Something very similar happens in financial markets. If I want to buy a stock, if I want to buy an asset, whether or not I want to buy this doesn't just depend on how much value I see in the asset. It also depends on how much value I think other people see in the asset. I can think that an asset is completely useless, but if I think other people think it's useful, perhaps mistakenly, I may still purchase it and contribute to raising its price, even though this asset, I'm very confident, is actually fundamentally worthless. And this leads to what's called herding and information cascades and subsequently to financial bubbles in stock markets. And these financial bubbles, when they eventually burst, like in property markets or in this happened in Kuwait, for example, in the 1880s and several times thereafter, globally in 2008, they had these securities that were based on subprime mortgages that people knew were ineffective, but people continued investing in them because they thought other people thought they were valuable. You get these bubbles, and when these bubbles burst, they can create a lot of damage to the economy. Something very similar happens in cancel culture. If I'm not sure whether a word is offensive or not, if I'm not sure if somebody's behaving well or not, and in particular, I'm not sure whether other people think that person's behaving well or behaving badly, I'm not sure if that other people think that word is offensive or is not offensive. This can create a situation where, because I don't want to stray from the herd, I ignore my own view and just do what other people do. And this could lead to a mutual enforcement analog to financial bubbles, whereby people mob unfairly or incorrectly assaults somebody online and causes a lot of damage just because people are scared to do something different to what the mob is calling for. So maybe I think that the statue of one of the people is a good statue and shouldn't be removed, but I'm scared to speak out. I'd just rather join in with the herd. Now, removing a statue is not a big deal, but if it comes to throwing stones at someone online, contributing to a doxing attack, or signing a petition for somebody's social media account to be closed, then it's something more serious. And so the results of me herding can be very significant for somebody else's life. Another feature of cancel culture is that there's no undo button. So one of the virtues of external enforcement is that when I externally enforce, I can also, as part of the system, even if this is slow, I can have a system for appeals and a system for, if I found people guilty, to hold them, to reverse the decision. If someone is convicted of a crime and they're actually subsequently found to be innocent, I can release them from prison, I can expunge their record, and I can hold them, I can compensate them for their losses. But in cancel culture, because it's a decentralized and spontaneous phenomenon, and that it's not structured, there's no system for undoing the damage that you've done to someone. It could be that we've identified the wrong person, and that's definitely happened. Somebody does a typo in someone's Twitter handle, and they assault the wrong person. Two people have got the same name. Somebody was misquoted. Somebody's quote was taken out of context. And the picture here I have is of Maximilien Robespierre. And the cartoon on the right is a famous cartoon of Robespierre. So after Robespierre executed a lot of people, and actually he had a situation where people would be put on trial, and if they were found guilty, they'd be executed the next day. So there wasn't any time for an appeal. And he did this on purpose, even though he knew that people might be incorrectly executed, because he thought it's better to make people even so scared of being against the revolution by threatening to cut their head off the day after their trial. It's better to do that because it will make sure that people are even more in favor of the revolution they would be if we didn't have this extreme punishment. And the cartoon is of Robespierre guillotining everyone in France, and then after he's finished guillotining everyone, he's guillotining the executioner, just to sort of complete the purge he was conducting. And something very similar happens in cancel culture. Once you've been singled out by a critical mass and doxed and harassed, that's it. There's no way, if it turned out that this was completely unwarranted, it's too late. The damage is done and there's no way of undoing it. And this is an inherent weakness. So, to synthesize, is it a blessing or a curse? Well, so I think that overall, we need to realize that there are circumstances when it works well. So cancel culture definitely works well when we are, first of all, when people have a good understanding of what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior. We all know that saying the N word is unacceptable. And so therefore anyone who uses it virtually has no excuse and therefore deserves to be publicly humiliated and so on and so forth. The problem is that when you have gray areas like a word like such as blacklist, where it may be offensive, may not, and here you can get into some of the problems of cancel culture. Secondly, we have to understand that cancel culture is something to be interpreted in the broader context where the alternative external enforcement may be failing. And here, the flexibility and adaptability of cancel culture is very empowering and very important in delivering good societal outcomes. If we always rely on external enforcement, a centralized entity dispensing justice, then we always have to worry about injustices, abuses of power. And although there are abuses of power in cancel culture, there can be different forms of abuse, and therefore in any soundly functioning society, we should expect to see a mixture of all these different solutions. So that concludes the mini lecture, and now I'd like to open the floor for questions and so on. So I'll look at the chat. Bear with me. So we have some anonymous attendees saying, would you relate doxing to naming and shaming? Yes, so doxing is very much naming and shaming. Doxing, to remind those who are not familiar with it, is where you put somebody's personal details on the internet with the goal of getting people to harass that person. It could be some very mild harassment, such as ordering a pizza, having it sent to their house, which they didn't order. Or it can be something very grave, such as, you know, infiltrating their bank accounts or harassing them or stalking them or something very grave. And that's very much a form of mutual enforcement of the same. It's a cousin of cancel culture because it's mutual enforcement, it's decentralized, it's spontaneous, and it doesn't have any control. So that's very much an example. I have a question from Victoria Najat. Did you want to ask it live? If you're online now, we'll be happy to hear the question. Okay, I'll read it then. Don't you think for cancel culture to be effective, we need first a system to adopt? Otherwise, we'll continue seeing what is happening in the world of injustice, violence, racism, inequalities, and most are all quiet. So the problem is that if you try to do any sort of formal system, then you need to have somebody in charge of implementing the system. And often, not always, but in many situations, whoever we designate to create the system will not deliver the system that is necessary because either that person is too slow to act, or that system is too slow. That system is abused either for the benefits of the person who's in charge of creating the system, or because of some other lobbyist who's able to control the person in charge of the system. So throughout history, sometimes we get positive changes in a centralized way where we have a system imposed and that system does the job. But sometimes we get powerful changes in a decentralized and unsystematic manner. And any society needs to be able to use all these different methods. If we rely on a system always, then in many situations, we will never have the system that we need. And we'll just be waiting and waiting and waiting. And we won't get the injustice addressed. And we see that in many in any developing countries, where in many dictatorial or tyrannical countries, where there's no civil society, where there's nowhere social media is banned, is closed, and where there's serious restrictions on freedom of speech and so on and so forth. And the consequence is that. And so the only way to address an injustice is through the system, quote unquote, and the system fails and is incapable of being reformed. Any other questions? Can you give an example of cancel culture in our society? Yes, so there's been some mini cancel culture in Kuwait recently. So we had so part of the COVID-19 crisis, certain people in Kuwait, including some celebrities, made some very negative comments about migrant workers. And so some people, a lot of people were in complete agreement with these comments about migrant workers. These celebrities would think things like the migrant workers they are the reason for the spread of COVID-19. They should be thrown out of Kuwait. They should not be allowed to have jobs in Kuwait, and so on and so forth. And other people thought this was unacceptable. And so sort of mini boycotts occurred. Now, to my knowledge, none of these boycotts ended up leading to an apology or anything like that, but it probably did affect the livelihood of some of these celebrities. Probably, in the case of certain fashionistas, they may have lost followers. They may have gained followers as well. But that's an example there. In Saudi Arabia, we see it sometimes when somebody outside, from outside Saudi Arabia says, and so Twitter is very popular in Saudi Arabia, and social media is very strong in Saudi Arabia. So sometimes when somebody says something negative about Saudi Arabia online, often a non-Saudi, someone from outside Saudi Arabia, and if that thing is based on an incorrect premise, then you'll see an attempt to rectify that using social media. A recent example I saw, a mild example, is there was an article, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, or maybe in the New York Times. And in the New York Times, they said that the quasi-cancellation of Hajj this year in Saudi Arabia is going to be the first time it happened. And obviously that's just a completely false statement, because Hajj has been cancelled. I believe somebody listed it. It's been even a dozen or more times since the birth of Islam in the 7th century. And the person put up, the list of exactly why it was stopped, all those different occasions. And this is bad journalism by the New York Times. And so there, people, had a social media campaign to humiliate the journalists professionally. Sometimes it stopped over the line, but a lot of it was very professional humiliation of, if you're going to write about something like this, then at least bother to do the basic research necessary. How can we apply this concept to a small economy such as Bahrain? Well, as I say, we see it in Bahrain. I don't have any examples immediately off the top of my head, but we often see people using social media to hold people accountable for what they do or say. If you take the example of members of parliament, we have members of parliament who are very active on social media. And one way in which they gauge the opinion of people in the country and in which they gauge the opinion of their constituents is via social media. So if a member of parliament says something which people think is ridiculous or stupid or wrong, people will tell them over social media and they will respond to that. Sometimes it's said in a very, unconstructive or aggressive way. Sometimes it's said in a more constructive way. But the channel works, and that plays a role in helping the member of parliament to rectify their behavior, or at least to consider an alternative view. But on other occasions, it's used badly, where somebody says something innocuous, but people harass them, maybe because they misunderstood that person. In the past, I myself have been what I would regard as unfairly targeted on social media for things I've said or done. But that's one of the risks of being online. Dr. Reem Daisi, how can we apply this? Oh, sorry, yeah, that's the question I just answered. Dr. Najat, we need to build a resilient and sustainable community and to teach our kids to say no, and not if you can beat them. If you can't beat them, join them. So it's true that, yeah, that's what we'd ideally like to do. But it's, and some societies definitely have that, more successful in that than others. If you see the Scandinavian countries, they have a lot more social cohesion and people are a lot more responsible online and offline than people in other countries. So I agree with you that ideally we would do that. But the reality is that actively building that is not something which is, many countries have succeeded in. So the Scandinavian countries have very good and socially cohesive societies, but it's something that is hundreds of years old. It's not something where a policymaker took a decision and the results showed up quite quickly. So unfortunately, although we all agree that we need to have resilience and resilient communities, it's still very difficult for anyone to determine how to actually build that. How do you suggest the government can counter a council movement towards a failed organization? So if an organization is failing, there can be a counter. How do you suggest the government can counter it? Well, assuming we want the government to counter it, presumably if it's a failing organization, we don't want the government to counter it because we want the government to do something about it. But if, for example, there's a council movement towards a successful organization, then, you know, at the end of then what can the government do? Well, the government can contribute to spreading awareness, can respond to the allegations circulating, and correct the views using, you know, in a transparent fashion. And that happens often. You know, so for example, in Bahrain, quite often something gets written in the global media that is just simply not true about Bahrain, and in that situation, the government can put out real data that helps people realize what is accurate and what is inaccurate. But then let's just flip to the other side. What can a government counter? What about when we have a situation where the council movement is correct? What do we want the government to do there? Well, if the council movement is correct, and we've seen that in many situations, we would want the government to respond to the council movement, alerting it to this, and take the necessary steps within the prevailing systems. So, as an example, if if there's a certain ministry in Bahrain that is not doing its job properly, and people complain on social media, then if that complaint reaches the Council of Ministers, the Council of Ministers should take the steps necessary to fix that. And council culture will have played a very positive role. Any other questions or interventions? We'd be happy to take interventions as well. Okay, well, thank you very much for tuning in today. And please continue to subscribe to our mailing list, events at darasat.org.bh, to be able, and follow us on Instagram and on Twitter so that you know about all our events. We have some very interesting events coming up in the next 2 weeks, and the communications team will be sharing those on our social media. Otherwise, I wish you an enjoyable weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.